Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Nick back with the Bass Hookup, and I want to start off by saying if you're new to the channel, welcome. Hopefully you learn a thing or two from us about fishing in general, fishing the Delta, fishing all the Northern California lakes, and you could apply it all over the country. All of it's the same. A bass is a bass. They pretty much have the same habits, same feeding patterns, and things like that. And if you are a subscriber or somebody that's been watching our stuff, thank you for your support. We truly appreciate it, and hopefully you've already learned something. If not, put a comment down below. Let us know what you want to hear, what you would like to know about. You want some bait reviewed, or anything you want. Just put down there in the comments, and we'll try to cover it. So, in today's video, we've been on the Delta, and there's a reason why we've been on the Delta. Or on these Delta videos is because the bite is going to pick up very, very fast, and it's going to be the best time of year for you to go out there and catch a lot of fish, and also some of the best fish you're going to catch all year are going to be caught in these next couple months. So we'd like to get this information out there for you all, so that way you have a great opportunity at going out there and having a good experience, whether it be you're bringing your kid out there, you're bringing anybody, or just going on your own for the first time. And the Delta, it's a huge fishery. It's confusing. It's intimidating, even for professional fishermen that, we've fished FLW in the past, National Guard Series and things like that. And for guys to come from across the country to fish the Delta, it's even intimidating for them because of the tidal waters and the different vegetation. Everything looks good. So we've talked about already in the last couple of videos how to approach the islands, what kind of banks we're kind of looking for, what type of toolies we're looking for this time of year, the ones that are offshore, the ones that are not the main island, but islands that have sparse toolie clumps out away from that main island on flats where those fish are going to move up and feed. We've covered some of those things. Today we're going to go over tides a little bit, and I'm not going to get into detail on the tides. If you want to know more detail on tides, exactly what they are and things like that, In Deep on the Delta did a video on that, and he explained it better than I would or I could. So what I'm going to talk about with tides is kind of show you on the map here on the computer again how that current is moving in and out of the system. We're going to talk about high tide versus low tide, where to look for fish on each of those tides at this time of year and why. And I'm also going to finish the video with how to follow that tide. Once you figure out the tide you want or the fish are biting, I'm going to show you by using the tools that are available to you online how to plan your trip to follow the tide that the fish are biting on. All right, so let's get started with that. First of all, you can see here I'm using this tidesandcurrents.noaa.gov. I like this website, and after watching this, you'll learn why, okay? So I've already opened up some windows so you don't have to watch me do it and fumble around. So basically when you go to the home button, you're going to see a map. And I selected California, and we'll just start way out here. And I want to start out here because I could show you kind of how the tide flows, just to give you a better understanding of following the tide later on, when I talk about that towards the second half of this video. I just want to give you kind of a visual of how these tides are flowing into our system. That way, when I go into more detail on how to follow the tide, it should click, and you'll understand exactly how we're following that tide and how we plan it out. So here, we have the Pacific Ocean, we got the bay, the San Francisco, then you have in here, you have Grizzly Bay, Big Break, Frank's Track over here, then the river goes up, Sacramento River, Rio Vista, all that. So to understand the tide at the most basic level, and maybe it's way too basic, but I'm going to cover it anyway. So high tide, all our water in the system obviously is coming from out here in the ocean. So it's flowing on incoming tide, it's all flowing this way. It's flowing from west to east. Okay? On outgoing tide, it's the exact opposite. It's flowing from east to west. Now, at the beginning of incoming tide, the higher tides, the closer, since it's going from west to east, you're going to have a higher tide at an earlier point in time the further west you are. Again, you're going to have a higher tide at an earlier point of time the further west you are. And it's the opposite for outgoing. And then for outgoing tide, the further east you are, the longer it's going to take for that tide to start getting sucked out. It's going to always come in first from the west, and then it's going to start going out first from the west, the further west you are, if that makes any sense. So your water's coming in this way, water's going out that way. All right? So on this site, you're able to predict the tides. So to do that, it's pretty cool because it gives you a visual. These are all stations where you could click into here and look at the current. But right now you can't see them all. So right now what I'm going to do is go over here to advanced, and then I'm going to select my data type as tidal predictions. Okay, now we have all these markers throughout the delta. So we have Collinsville over here, all the way, you know, about as far west as you're going to go to catch any largemouth bass. And then you have the Port of Stockton, about as far east as the delta goes, kind of dead ends right here. And then down south, we have Grant Line Canal, Grant Line Drawbridge down here. If I want to look at this map with a little more detail, you could select, you know, water level, air temp, water temperature, barometric pressure, winds, all those things over here. If I want a different view, let's look at the satellite view. Go ahead, click the satellite view. You can still see all of your markers where you could click into and look at what the tide's going to be. And I already have a few laid out up here. All right, and we'll get into that. But let's talk about high tide first. Where do you look on high tide, and why is it that high tide is, I would say right now, the best tide to fish? There's a few reasons. One reason that the high tide is the best tide to fish, in my opinion, right now, whether it be sometimes it's high or the end of incoming, sometimes it's the beginning of outgoing. Either way, it's high tide. You have your highest water levels at that point in time. The reason for that is, I believe, is because the fish in the delta always seem to feed up shallow on high tide. And as fishermen, the delta is a visual place. We like to throw up shallow. We like to throw our crankbaits, chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, Senkos up there on the rocks, right against the toolies. And on high tide, that water comes up to a level where those fish are comfortable. They move up as shallow as they could get to feed. If you think about a lake, lakes typically fish better when the water is rising. As the water rises in a lake, the fish move right up and eat that nutrients that's coming off the shoreline with that water level. As the water levels drop, the fish back off and kind of suspend, and fishing gets tough. It's almost the same in the delta. It's about the same. So as the tide comes up, those fish move right up, get those crawdads and things like that are in those rocks, in the mud, that were out of the water. Now they're in the water and they're coming out, crawling around. Those fish move up and eat them. Another key thing, and why fishing is good on high tide in the delta, especially this time of year, is if you have a high tide, let's say at 2 p.m., 3 p.m., and so if high tide is 2 p.m., 3 p.m., that means it was low tide at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m., 10 a.m., whatever, okay? So the water's low when the sun's out, and those rocks are in that sun heating up, right? They're heating up in the sun. They're heating up all day long. They have the chance to heat up, and your tide's rising slowly, and it's slowly rising. And at 1 or 2 p.m., 3 p.m., it's finally high tide. Well, those rocks had time to heat up throughout the day, and I think at this time of year, once it's high tide on those rocks or those areas, the water temp's just a little bit warmer, and fish will go up there and sun. They'll sun their eggs. They'll go up there to feed, and I think that's why one of the best places to look on high tide, and what I like to fish on high tide a lot, is rock banks. And we talked about which rock banks in a previous video, and the rock banks that you're looking for are not really, really deep rock banks. They're rock banks that have a flat on them. So the rocks come down, and then they maybe it's 2-3 feet deep right off of the rock, and then it's a flat. So if your boat's 20-30 feet off the bank, you're only sitting in like 7-8 feet of water, not in 20 feet of water. Okay, those fish will get up there on the flat. And also, when you're looking for a rock bank, is a rock bank that has rock banks in the delta could have sporadic sparse tules even off the bank growing on that flat. That's even better, where there's a rock bank and then there's tules, maybe not just a straight line of tules for 100 yards, but patches of tules. A patch of tules that's a 5x5 patch, then a clean stretch of rock, then another patch of tules, then maybe a 5-foot stretch of rock and another patch. Those are prime areas where if there's a bass along this whole shoreline, it's probably setting up on one side of those tules in front of them. Sometimes they're just right on the rock in between the two tules. That'll be the best. Another good spot on high tide is going to be your sparse tules out away from the islands. Like if you guys saw our last video where my brother was out there catching fish, that was high tide. He was catching them on those sparse tules out away from the islands on high tide. And another reason high tide's just better, maybe it's not technically better, but for us fishermen, it's easier to fish because of the weed growth, right? On low tide, on those tules that are out away from those islands especially, sometimes there's so much weeds on low tide, you're flipping in the weeds, you don't feel like you're going to get bit, it's too shallow to throw a crankbait, you're getting too many weeds on your chatterbait, it's just too tough to fish. The fish might be there in a foot of water. Most likely, they're probably pulled off, so that you're also not getting bit because of that reason. But it's just better on high tide. You have that water that'll cover those weeds. Fish will move up. They'll be feeding. And that's why, it's important this time of year to go out there, time it where you're going to be out there on a high tide, a good high tide. All right, so that's high tide. Low tide. What do you do on low tide this time of year? And it's a good question because I don't think the fish move that far off from where they were, right? So if you're fishing a rock bank, you're fishing that same rock bank and you're sitting 20-30 feet off the bank, it's 8 feet deep, and there's patches of tules. Sometimes those rock banks, it's still deep enough on low. If you have a foot or 2 feet of water up next to those patches of tules or on the rock and not too many weeds, there's probably still fish right there. But you got to remember, every rock bank does not stay shallow and flat forever. So if you follow that flat and you look at the topographical map like I discussed in the last video, you could find where that flat transitions into a steeper bank closer to those rocks. And a lot of times that's where the fish move, and you'll even have this time of year, pre-spawn bass coming out of their winter haunts to feed, staging at those spots on low tide. So those bass that were up on the flat on high, when it drops, let's say it drops 3 feet, there's no water up there, there's only a foot of water, the bass will either just pull directly out and you need to fish, the sparse weeds or the weed line out in like 5 to 8 feet of water and just throw your crankbait, spinnerbait, chatterbait, whatever on that weed line, or follow that bank to where the flat starts to go in towards the rocks and it gets deeper, closer to that rock bank, and focus on those spots. And visually, let's say this is flat from here. Let's say it's flat from here to right here. Typically on the points, it's going to be a little deeper because you have current running into it. And on the inside of these bends, sometimes it's deeper because the current's either coming this way, you've been hitting it for years, or it's coming in this way and hitting this spot for years. So it's kind of dug out a little hole here. Same thing around the point. It's been washing around that point, digging it out. So let's just say, for example, this is example. I don't know if this is the case on this bank, but from here to here, it's real flat, and you're catching them here on high tide. Low tide comes around, you need to try this area where it gets deeper. These fish will move, pull out, and come right here where it gets a little deeper. So try that part, and then try this point. It gets a little deeper right here off the flat. Try around the point, because any fish that was up here, they're just going to move into this little bit of deeper water, or they're going to move off the bank a little bit and just focus in that 3 to 4 or 5 foot of water and go along the bank and just fishing the outside stuff, not necessarily casting up in there. All right, and these spots this time of year where it's deep and it transitions onto a flat bank, those are key spots. So like I talked about the points of these islands being key spots, just the point and then around the bends of those points being key spots, think about these spots the same way. Think about, this flat is the island, and each side of it there's a deep side. Just think of those as being the points. So if you run that deep bank right where it transitions to the flat on each side of the flat and the island points, you're going to do good. Another spot on the low tide that could be good is, I think I talked about it before, and I'll say it again, each of these islands has a flat side, each has a deep channel side. Well, if the tide goes way out and it's low, those fish will just move to the points, and they might just be right here, right on the deep side. They might be down a little bit, this way. They might be just sitting right on the point, and that goes for both sides of the point. If they were on this flat, you could kind of see it, how flat it is right there. They're just going to move right on the outside of this weed line, or right here, waiting for the tide to come back up. When it comes back up, they'll just swim right back around and move up to feed again. Another spot on low tide that always seems to hold fish is hard structure. So in any of the, not any, but if in some of these flooded islands you have trees offshore, that's hard structure. They're going to move off the bank. A lot of the trees are in 5 to 10 feet of water. They'll move and hold on that. You have these bridges everywhere around the delta. They'll be on the bridge pilings. They'll hold to the hard structure. Docks all throughout Disappointment. Docks in marinas. Things like that. On low tide, sometimes it's very hard to get bit, but if you want to get a bite, a good place to start on low tide are hard structure spots. And again, what I mean by that is docks, trees that are offshore, bridge pilings. Usually you could get yourself a bite. Or anywhere there's like a sunken ship like that. Around the sunken ship, they're all throughout the delta, and you focus on those areas on low tide just to get a bite, and you can keep getting a bite. That way your day doesn't feel like you're just waiting for high tide all day. If you fish the hard structures, you'll probably still be able to get bit. Sometimes you'll pull up to a place like that, and you'll catch a lot of big ones, and they'll be on that. I mean, then you might be waiting for low tide your next trip out because you did so good on low tide. So that's the low tide spot. But on low tide, really, this time of year, I would say is typically not the best. You could get some bites on the hard structure, but where low tide excels is during the summer months. Summer, September, the fall, when you're on a good punch bite, when the fish are biting the punch bait, I prefer low tide. Why? Because it pinpoints those fish and those weed lines that you couldn't see on high tide. Now, the tide sucks out. You could see, this is all hypothetical again. So let's say right here there's a weed line here. High tide, this is underwater. I couldn't see it. This stuff over here is underwater. I can't really see it. Tide goes out, it's low. Now I could see this clean hydrilla line right here. Clean hydrilla, I could see clean hydrilla all right here. Those fish are just going to sit in those weeds right on the weed line with that strong current moving by because it's summertime again. I'm talking about summertime and the punch bite. They're going to sit right there, and I could pinpoint those fish. I know if there's a fish that had swim up and down this bank on low tide, it's just going to go whoop, suck right into these weeds. If it's swimming this way, it's just going to sit right here. So I don't need to waste time fishing any of this. I could just go on low tide, hit my key obvious spots. Come in here, punch this mat, one here, one on this side, move to this one. One left, couple in the middle, one right, move to the next one. Down any of these banks where you have, clean hydrilla that's offshore, find a hard, clean hydrilla line or patches of it, and just go along and punch it. Punch it. So again, in low tide's not always bad. This time of year, it's not great. Summertime, I'm looking for low tide. Okay? So since high tide is the tide I'd like to fish right now. Again, it puts water up over those warmer rocks. It puts water up over the weeds, so I could throw baits I like to throw, like the crankbait, spinnerbait, even flipping a Senko, and the fish that are suspended out or down off those shelves of the islands out deep, kind of waiting for high tide, they'll move up and use that opportunity to feed. Let's talk about how you follow the high tide. To follow the high tide, let's zoom out. I'm going to use a tool like this so I can plan my day. Alright, we have all these tidal markers right here. And if I click on any of these, I could look at what the tide is going to be. So let's start on Collinsville. And this is just to give you an example because I want to go from far west to far east. So Collinsville, I already have it open here. You can see Collinsville, Sacramento, California. And I have over here selected this chart to show me 1 day's worth of time. So I have February 20th, which is tomorrow. Tomorrow in Collinsville, high tide is at 8:20. Right there, 8:20 a.m. is 3.59 feet at 8:20 a.m. So hypothetically speaking, if I want to hit high tide all day long, I would have a spot down there in Collinsville or somewhere that direction, okay? And I'd want to go there first. And I'm going to show you why. Because at 8:20 a.m. it's high tide all the way west, right out here. Now let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum. Black Slough, all the way over here. This is near, going towards Stockton. Black Slough Landing. It's not high tide there until 11:09. So if I'm planning to go out there first thing in the morning, and I don't want to fish low tide all day, I'm going to find a spot out here somewhere, out west, because like I was saying, the water's flowing in. It's going to be high tide first the further out west you go. So I'm going to find a spot out west. So 8:20 a.m. it's high tide. The best time of that tide is going to be probably from 6 a.m., this last hour and a half of incoming, and the first hour and a half of outgo. But if I want to stick with this part of the tide, I'm going to come out here at 7 a.m., fish that last part of incoming and the first part of outgo, and now I got to move. So where am I going to go? I'm going to go east to follow that tide. I'm out here. I'm going to go east. So I went from here. Let's say I want to go into somewhere around Frank's Track. So we're going to look at Sandmound Slough on this side of the track. Sandmound Slough, high tide's at 10:38. Big difference. So we went from right here just to here, and we had an 8:20 high tide out west, and we have a 10:38 high tide in Frank's Track. So I could spend that first hour and a half, hour of incoming, or last hour of incoming, and let's see, 10 a.m.'s right here, so 8:20, so an hour and a half, I have to fish, or an hour here of the beginning of outgo, all the way out west. And if you want to really be disciplined about it, you really got to keep an eye on your watch. Keep an eye on your watch, have these tides written down somewhere. I like to write them down and actually put them on a piece of paper, and then I'll tape it the night before to my console. So when I'm driving around, I could see right there what the tides are all over the delta. Or I'll pick like 4 spots like I did here. so I at least know where those changes are, or high tide, low tide are. So let's say I'm here at 10 o'clock or 9:30, time to go. I want to stick with this high tide. We need to go. We need to start running east. Next spot, Frank's Track. I get into Frank's Track around 10 o'clock. Now I'm at the very end of incoming, and I could fish it a little past incoming, and then the beginning of outgoing. 12 o'clock, probably 12:30 is going to be your best bite from here, top of high tide to 12:30. So that first hour and a half, 2.5 hours of outgoing tide. Tide's still pretty high, a lot of fishable water. But what do we do when it's this time? Well, maybe we just want to fish this part of the tide. We could stick with that all day almost. So we could go from here, 10 o'clock. Well, let's go even further. Let's go even further east. This is for Ward's Island, which is, we're going from the track all the way to here, Ward's Island. So it's not that far, so the tide difference isn't that much. But again, if you stick with the tide, you could stay on high tide for quite a while. So from Frank's to Ward's, I'm going to Ward's Island, and high tide's at 10:54. So what was it at Frank's Track? 10:38. So about a 20-minute difference. So if I fish the track for an hour, I fish it until about 11, run over to Ward's. 11 o'clock would be right after that beginning of, right after the high tide topped out. Get there at 11, and I could fish a good portion of that outgoing tide, the high outgoing tide, which could be key. All right, so I fished that. So I fished that until 12:30. 1 o'clock's probably still good, because at 2 o'clock it's about not even midway of the outgoing tide yet. So let's say I fish it till 1 or 2. Time to go. We caught some fish there. That tide's awesome. I want to follow it. So I already have it planned out the day before. So we're going to keep on going east. And I go all the way over here, let's say to Black Sioux, or this is 14 Mile Slough right here. Go all the way over there. Do I have time? Yeah, it's 11:09. So let's say I quit fishing Wards at 1:30. I come over here all the way to 14 Mile Slough, and it's 1:30. So we're right here. We're really when it starts to really pick up. So we're still at a high tide, beginning at outgo, and I can fish that for the rest of the day, all the way through, around this time period, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. Low tide's not until 8 p.m. So that's just to give you guys, an idea of how you would follow the tide. Obviously, if you wanted to follow low tide, be the exact opposite. Be just the opposite. If you wanted to, after you hit this tide, and you wanted to stay with high tide, if you had just all day to be out there, what would you do? Well, you're going to go from 14 Mile way east, and you're going to go back west as far as you can, because the tide's going to be coming in again sooner west than it is where you're sitting at way east. That gives you an idea of how you would follow the tides from east to west and stay with that high tide throughout the whole day. And that's how you would want to stay with high tide is, again, it's going to be higher sooner out west. So anytime you want to stay with a high tide all day, look at the tidal predictions the day before, and it's always going to be that higher tide a lot sooner the further out west you're going to be. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit from this video, and a lot of preparation goes into planning your day if you want to follow the tide. It's not easy. You got to be dedicated. You got to be looking at your clock. When it's time to go, you need to go to your next spot. Another thing is you need to have spots that you already know, that you already have confidence in, so you could run all the way from the west side of the delta to the east side and back and forth and down south. That way, you can't really follow the tide without knowing the spot you're gonna go to next. We are going to come out with another series that's just going to be all about the financials of fishing. So going to be all about the financials of fishing tournaments. So we're fishing a lot of different tournament circuits. We've done it a long time. So we're going to talk about boat costs, maintenance, all the tackle we buy in preparation for the tournament. We're going to talk about the tournament entry fees, and also if we win, we're going to add that in there. And we're going to show you exactly our basically how much we've won, how much we've lost, and at the end of the year, you'll be able to see, you know, hopefully we won some money, but if we lose, you'll be able to see how much we lost. So if you're interested in knowing, is it worth it to fish tournaments? Can I make a living off of it? Not even a living. Can I make some money off of it? Can I make some extra money off of it? Sure, you can, but it takes a lot of time on the water. Tons of time on the water. The guys you're competing against, they spend a ton of time out there, and they have for years. So if you're interested in that, that's going to be coming out shortly, and more videos like this will be coming out. So again, thank you for watching. We're also going to do a tournament prep video. So I'm going to walk through what my bait selection is going to be for that upcoming tournament. So I'm going to go over my bait selection, what I'm going to have tied on at the beginning of the day. I'm going to go back over this map, and I do want to follow the tide, so I'm going to talk more about that and where I plan to fish and how I'm going to follow the tide and how I plan out my day according to tide, according to weather, and the baits I'll be throwing. And then after that, you guys will actually see the tournament footage and how it plays out. So if that sounds good to you, like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you next time.